Myron Scholes, welcome. You were awarded the 1997 Bank of Sweden Prize in Economic Sciences together with your friend Robert Merton, and we didn't catch you for interview when you came to Stockholm to receive the prize, so we're very happy to catch you 11 years later here in Linda. I'd like to begin by asking about your childhood. You were brought up in rural Canada.
Correct.
And you displayed an early interest in economics. You were investing in stocks as a high school student.
Correct.
What was the attraction?
Well, being born in northern Canada, there were many mining companies in northern Canada, silver mining companies and gold mining companies, and my parents and my aunts and uncles who lived nearby always were looking for the next strike, either in gold or in silver, which would make a large amount of money. So they would be attracted to buying stocks that were maybe a few pennies with the expectation that they might jump to multiple dollars or several dollars.
And so they were constantly doing that, weren't
Yes,
they?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
They never prospected themselves. They would.
No, they were prospecting through others.
That's right. And
that wasn't their profession.
but if you observed them doing it and saw that I don't know if they weren't successful.
No, they weren't successful.
If you observed them doing it and not being successful, you nevertheless saw that there was the potential to be successful and wanted to take the risk.
I tried to, that was partially what attracted me, was to say, is there different methods or different ways than just trying to find a rumor and act on the rumor of possible findings of gold or silver. But I became interested in realizing indirectly in my naive way how markets worked at that time, or didn't work.
So it was a problem, much like, I don't know, chess or something, to be solved. You saw it as, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. You had some problems with your eyes when you were young, I believe, which made it difficult to read.
Correct.
And they were quite severe. It was really difficult to read.
Right.
Were there concomitant benefits from that? I think you've described previously.
Yes. I mean, I had always felt that you compensate. So it makes you, in my case, I was able to listen more intently or to try to concentrate more on what I was hearing in class or what others were telling me. I felt that that was a compensating benefit, which gave me that ability, and I thought that that was a compensating benefit at the time.
Mm. Was there ever the possibility that you wouldn't be able to see as an adult?
Well, I had not. As a young person, I had felt that that wasn't in the realm of things. In other words, but if one's keratoconus, it's called, which is actually the fact that the cornea tends to become elongated over time, and then scar tissue develops at the end of the cornea and creates, because the cornea does not remain spherical but becomes elongated, it means that you have, your astigmatism increases dramatically over time. So the light that comes into the eye does not go to the retina and refract in the correct angle. I had always had felt that I had have thick glasses and the like, and but it sort of arrested itself. It didn't become more severe. It became more severe, I guess, in my right eye at the time than my left eye, but somehow my left eye seemed to stabilize. And so I felt that, with that even though that it was more difficult to see, that things had tended to stabilize and things would be fine. Mm-hmm. But then I was fortunate when that new technology had been developed that allowed one to have cornea replacements, and fortunate that my vision was restored, though I've had 4 cornea transplants over time, so 2 in each eye, because they wear out. Basically, they last from 35 to 40 years at more of the extreme, and you can, fortunately, that other people are willing to donate cornea to the banks and be able to have the transplants.
Gosh, so is there another? There's another in the offing at some point then?
Well, I hope not. My oldest one was 1992, and well, if I live
or maybe you should say you hope so, because
maybe I hope so. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah.
So living another 20 or so years.
So, and in contrast to many of the economics laureates who, for instance, started in maths or physics and gradually moved across to the field, you were fairly formed as a potential economist when you went to McMaster University.
Right. Yes.
Did it live up to expectations? Were you satisfied with what you found when you entered the field?
I felt I was very fortunate in the sense that the professors that I had at McMaster directed me to readings of some of the stars or acolytes in economics, such as Milton Friedman or George Stigler, for example, even reading more of the populist type of economics of Galbraith or others, and obviously Samuelson, and that led me to really wanted to broaden my mathematics and other skills in conjunction with economics, because I thought it was a wonderful area and just a science that was really attractive to me.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in general it's very important for young people studying to read the classics, to go back and connect with the old literature?
I think to be creative in any area, in economics, which is my area, that to understand the area, to understand what the underlying theory is of the what is the basic foundations of a science, gives one an ability to create, because you have to go back. It's necessary to go back to first principles, really, to create, and to have the correct foundation is the way in which you can really add value. So to do things only from a technical aspect could leave a lot of on the table, a lot of ideas that you don't see. Mm-hmm. And I think everything in science, the way I think about it, is it's inductive in that you gather data. So if you gather it for the classics or any particular way you gather it is to your advantage. You gather data, so you're inductive, and then you stop at a moment in time, and you become deductive. You have to deduce, so it's integration and differentiation. Integration is adding things up, and differentiation is deciding what is relevant to throw away and what is relevant to keep. And so to be able to create whatever tools you use to gather information and to form then your opinions, and then you stop and then you deduce things, and after you deduce things, then the future tells you whether your deduction was not contaminated by the information that you had gathered in the first place.
Yeah. I suppose another key part of that is choosing the right problem to be inductive about. What led you to your choice of problem for your PhD thesis, which was done in Chicago?
Well, what led me to the topic initially that I chose at Chicago, which was on studying what the extent of the market was in securities, was that there was controversy. When I had done reading from one group, that group had led to the belief that there wasn't the degree of substitution in markets that I, through my Chicago training, would believe that to be the case, and that I had really formed my views on that it's the characteristics of financial instruments that are important, what returns they provide and what risks they have, which is crucial, not whether it is a particular security on its own, such as, and as a result of that, I decided that if I can figure out ways to test or differentiate the alternative views, that I could add value to science. And I use to this day in my thinking and the work to what degree of substitution exists among assets, so that creates an ability for us to understand how assets are going to come back together in pricing. If they deviate, then there's an incentive for people to correct the differentiation or the deviation. But it's fascinating that people always fall away and don't go back to that common belief. And as a result, they tend to not see the bigger picture, the direction of how market prices are going to change and correct. So this idea of substitution, which I developed, and at the same time I also was able to distinguish controversy between how information affects security prices and why asset prices tend to change, which was new concepts at the time.
Right. So just return to the controversy idea. You identified fields that were controversial. Were they also packed with other researchers, or were they fairly open?
Fairly open. At the time, it was fascinating. When I started off in economics and then moved to finance, which became financial economics, there was not at that time a use of economic theory in finance. It was a lot of rules of thumb and a lot of intuition. So it was experiential. A lot of things were stories or experiential ideas. And I think one of the that I and others who entered the field were able to do is take it and systematize it, or go away from just experience the theory. If you have a theory, okay, then you can empirically test the theory, and that you can make predictions based on the theory. If it's all experiential, it's too noisy. You don't have enough concepts to be able to predict what's going to happen. So one of the interesting parts about having a theory or economic theory or other theories is that theory then allows you to compress the noise and to be able to make predictions about the theory, about the future from the theory, to be able to figure out what you expect, or you can test various implications. So I think that one of the advantages that I had was that the whole area was more experiential and not theoretically based. So I was able to build theory, and then the theory led to prediction. The prediction then was affirmed by the data, and the data then also helped build additional theory, because as you tested things, you learn more. So it comes from theory to testing, then testing creates potential anomalies where you looked at the things that were thought to be second order are not second order, they're first order, and then new theory comes, and that ability to create or use theory and experience, or theory and testing, empirical testing, and then new theory is the way a science or field is built.
And it depends on a good linkage between the theoreticians and the experimentalists.
That's correct.
And is that to be found within financial economics? Do those two groups come together, or do they tend to be the same people?
Well, I was cross-pollinized. I did a lot of empirical work at the same time as I did theoretical work at, I think that there are those who are just theorists, and there are those who are empirical oriented only, and then there's also those who have a commonality.
I mean, there's always the slight sort of distancing of theoreticians from empirical economists, that in all sciences you do get a group of people who belong to one or the other, theoretical or experimental.
Correct.
Do you think that's less of a problem in economics than other sciences? Would you be able to say?
Well, not necessarily, because obviously you will in economics we have compartmentalization. So you have that some are just pure theorists and don't do any empirical work at all, and some are just empirical researchers who do empirical work. And it's hard to say comparatively among sciences whether that's the case. You have, it depends on your orientation, and I think that my orientation and some of my brethren and sisterins who are in the profession really have believed that finance is a living area, or financial economics is living, and that if you can marry the two together, the empirical with the theoretical, that you'll have a richer science, you'll have a richer results than if you were to just concentrate on one area alone. Because how do you, as you said earlier, which I think is a crucial question, how do you find the problems to work on? And that if you don't use the world as a place to find problems, then the problem selection from a theoretical perspective might be wonderful from a theoretical perspective, because we all make assumptions. You know, we have our glossary or assumption, then we devise models from the assumptions. But if the assumptions are disjoint from reality, then the importance of the results are not necessarily great. And so we have to, one of the fascinating things about research, as you said, is selecting problems, but the real world, or the world around us, gives us a lot of information about what problems to study. So when I did my thesis, or I have done other papers, I've always been using puzzles or problems that I see that don't purport to have been understood or studied in the literature as my entry into thinking about how I might model or address those problems.
I suppose the classic example of that is the option pricing model that you developed with Fisher Black.
Correct.
When you were a postdoctoral researcher at MIT.
Oh, no, actually, I was an assistant professor at that time. Sorry. Yeah, just a young assistant. So I had finished my postdoctoral work at Chicago, and then I shipped off to MIT.
Right, you'd entered the tenure track. And,
correct.
So that was a very real-world problem that you were dealing with, right. How to price derivatives. It turned out to be a fundamentally brilliant choice of problem to work on, because you solved it. But I'd like to discuss a little bit the sort of creative milieu that you found yourself in at MIT. It was obviously a great place to be. What made it so good at that time?
Well, I think that all of us who had come into financial economics at that time, whether it was at Chicago or MIT, Chicago, which I left, and MIT, which I joined, felt a little bit akin to kids in the candy store, you know, because there were so many problems that seemed to be interesting to address that research seemed easy. You know, it seemed as though, wow, look at all these interesting problems. Now, maybe it was the case that all of us were fortunate to have been trained in classical economics and, you know, using other tools we had as well. But we entered a new area, and no one in the profession had really addressed the problems in that area. So you had all this training, and at the same time all these problems to try to solve, and yet it was terrific. It was akin to, as one of my grandchildren or my children previously would, a new game would come out, you know, and say, wow, I have to solve this game. And so, you know, they wait for it, and no one had done it before, and you have that ability to be excited about going forward and trying to address these problems. I think that it was that all of us that were in the field at that time, or came together in the field at that time, and there was a great group of young people, had a lot of the venture or the explorer attitude, and you know, we weren't bound by the past, and we were not doing research. Like, research is researching what others have done. You know, we were able to search. You know, it was like searching for new things to work on. That was the fascinating part of it. It was like we were in a whole new territory, whole new areas, and I can imagine the fascination of explorers who ventured off from Europe to find the New World, and and Magellan or Christopher Columbus or others, and coming across these areas that no one had discovered before, and being truly excited about the possibilities of developing theory and at the same time to be able to test that theory.
It's a lovely image, the idea of this sort of exploration frontier. Do you think it's cyclical? Do you think in academic economics, there are times when there are lots of new frontiers visible, and then there's a sort of change, and then there's a time when it's less difficult to find, less easy to find research topics, and then you get back to a point where suddenly they're available again?
Well, I agree with that characterization. I would say the following is also a fascination to me, is that sometimes areas don't have any theory, okay, and then one has the idea of building the theory. And what is theory? Theory is really the fundamental principles. It's how things will act, and then it relies on others to test the theory. So the theory then goes to the testing stage, and then obviously the theory, which makes assumptions, the assumptions are not accurate 100%, because it would be in terms of that would defines a model. A model is an abstraction of reality, and so basically then you've gotten the major factors that are sort of first order, and then what one thought was sort of second order or noise. Others say, well, no, that's not really second order. The noise should be added, and interestingly enough, as the field becomes developed or more developed, then the factors are expanded. It's fleshed out, so to speak, and that's hard work, to flesh out. So it's wonderful to be the architect, and thinking about how to design something. But then once you're the architect, you go to the next stage. You have to put meat on the bones. So you have a fixed point, and then you think about how to specify how the walls are going to be, or the rooms. Once you make that decision, someone has to build the house, and so that's how the science proceeds, from the architect to the specification writer to the subcontractors to the builder and the subcontractors, to make it all come to whole. And as you go along, you can have most of research is akin to the house, but everything is not pre-specified. You have the design of the house, a concept for the house, and then that's the exciting part of that. And then once the house starts to be built, you learn, and you keep changing and adding, and it improves, and it gets better and better. So it's very unlikely that the original frontier people or the original house designers or the architect or the person you're building the house for is going to know exactly what it is, because the future is this. It's so rich in information that it takes a lot of time and a lot of revision to make it better and better over time.
That's very interesting. It sort of argues that you're needing different sorts of academics to really pursue research programs over decades in the most effective way. And I guess that certainly isn't thought about when one's producing the new generation of graduate students and postdocs. Which frontier are you coming to? Which point in the frontier? Should you be an architect? Should you be a builder?
That's correct. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that in a lot of ways, and the house could be finished. I mean, the area could be finished, and there's no more actually to explore. At the margin, you can make revisions, and we do. I mean, obviously, you live in a house for 5 years, you start saying, oh, I need to change this room or that room, and we do. I mean, and science goes on. But deciding on when it's the time to leave this house and build a new house, continue to use the analogy, that's tough, because if I'm in options and I deal with option theory and build a basic option theory, that it sort of becomes my job to defend, what I've done. And newer people are coming along all the time and thinking about new ways of thinking about this problem, or they use the designs, whether it's von Mises or others, who are the great architects, and they refine what they've done, or whole new ideas, like Picasso could have, one stage and then have a completely new stage in how he tends to paint things, or he can keep refining what you do. I always remember being struck when I saw the retrospective at the Modern Art Museum in New York of Matisse, and you saw all the earlier works had the basic ingredients that he used in his subsequent work, but every new picture that he saw, I couldn't see the wondrous ways in which he combined the previous elements in the new work that he had done. Creativity is that way. When you have the expertise or understand the various pieces, then as a researcher, you're possible to put them together in new ways or different ways, that a new piece of art that someone sees, but they see that art in a completely different way because you saw it in a completely different way. So that architect might stay in a particular area forever, as Matisse did, or you can be akin to Picasso, who said, I want to be in my blue period for a while, and I do research in this area, but now I don't think I can add more to that. I'll go and do work in a completely different area. And in his case, he was tremendously innovative in the multitude of areas that he had. Some academics, and rightly or wrongly, there's no right or wrong in this, Matisse sort of stayed in one particular way and grew from those roots, but Picasso didn't. He just changed his fields and was productive in others. You could see it. Now, other artists or other researchers have the advantage as doctoral students, is to cross-fertilize. They take my class, or they take the class of another professor or a whole other group of professors, and they can steal ideas from all of us, and then they can say, well, I can now generate a whole new area, or I can stay with one particular professor and do research or add to the profession.
You mentioned the idea of defending one's area, and one of the interesting things about your work in options theory at MIT was that when you published your new options pricing model, it was very widely accepted. There didn't seem to be a great deal of resistance to it, although it's kind of overturned the way that people have been doing it previously. Why do you think that was? Why? Because often new research doesn't meet with such immediate approval.
Right. Among the academic world, it didn't necessarily have approval instantaneously. It was very difficult for us to publish our paper. We actually had our first results, our bakery results, in 1970, and it took till 1973 to publish the paper. It was rejected by many journals as being wrong, or in certain cases too arcane and not general enough for the profession. So yes, in some sense, in the academic world, it wasn't initially accepted. It did have, among some, it was accepted when I gave presentations or paper, but it was very new, and so people wanted to study it. They really thought that things were incorrect, and then when sort of Bob Merton came up with a subsequent proof that another way to do what we had done, and then it became somewhat accepted, not necessarily being of the same importance or not, but take quantum theory. I mean, when you had a lot of people in quantum theory who had their views where you had Schroeder talking about the fence and the cat behind the fence. You could either see the cat as a slice, as a cat sliced, or you can think of it as a whole cat, but it's hard to do both. And then having others that followed on, such as Heisenberg and others who showed it in a more precise way, then it developed an area and became accepted in the profession. But it's the difference in our work was that it was also accepted broadly among practitioners in addition to academics. Academics were more skeptical and took time to take it on, but practitioners took it on very quickly and started to use it in their own work.
So did that actually drive academic acceptance, the fact that...
Yes, because because again, it was the data. One of the nice things was you went from theory and then you could test it. The option market was born almost simultaneously with the publication of our work, even though we had not done it in anticipation of the option market being formed and put into practice. But it was an interesting experiment because on the floor of the exchanges, like the Chicago Board Option Exchange, you had those who were experienced traders who had, just from experience, had traded options over the counter. Over the counter is not an organized exchange, but from a broker-dealer would quote prices on options. They had experience. And then you had the young persons who had been in school and had studied the option pricing theory the previous year or so. And they had sheets. They used only theoretical prices, and used empirical estimates of how to calibrate the model. And the two of them fought each other in the sense only experienced people know theory, and the theory no experience. And over time, the theory people wiped out just the experienced people, in the sense they left the exchange and it became more theoretical, but the theory people then added their own empirical information to do it. But here was the first time in finance that you had a valuation model. You could that a researcher could value a security and then look in the market and say, wow, I didn't use the prices that existed and I could see a value, and they're close. One is very close to the other. And that, when you validate a theory by observing prices, it creates then an ability to augment one's intuition. Because just intuition alone or experience alone gets you so far. But once we have a model, then we test the model. That tends to reinforce intuition. And with the model or theory, we can add to intuition. So you can, I always think of it as a bootstrap. Theory helps with your intuition, and intuition, once you have the theory or the model, then allows for more intuition or insights. And more intuition or insights leads to a better models, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And they build on each other.
So during the 3 years that it took to get published, did you ever lose confidence in your own model?
No, I was actually, I knew we were correct. I had the idea that, because again, it was just using fundamental economics and to solve the problem, and substitution. Again, what I had talked about is that if we could create a security that replicated the option, they'd have to be priced the same. And so we had, in my view, we had replicated. We had, and also we were challenged by people in the profession that I thought were terrific, such as Robert Merton initially challenged the work, and thought that we were not correct, and that was great. And then that's having a wonderful colleague who takes the time and to challenge your work, and Paul Samuelson and others at MIT who had challenged it and really tried to understand it. And then when Robert Merton was able to develop his alternative proof, obviously that gave me a lot more confidence that we were correct. So he was willing to come back and say no, that we were correct. And so science is interesting. You always, initially you have a new insight or a new solution, but then you obviously are skeptical. You say, am I correct? Have I forgotten something? But the wonderful part of being an academic is your ability to have your colleagues challenge what you're doing, and do it in a way of constructive criticism. It's not, and that adds to value. And once those I respected had vetted what we had done, I felt that it would be published over time. The profession would come to agree, and rightly so, that it was our fault I believe that we didn't get it published initially simply because we probably didn't explain it correctly. We didn't take, and as you said earlier, I think another point was it was so new and so different from what initial intuition would be, that to come to take our technology and internalize our technology and understand the methodology and how that methodology is used was so new that that had to be internalized, because we took a completely different way or tact or method to value the option that anyone had used previously. And the results that came out were counterintuitive. I mean, it was, unless you understood, unless someone in the profession had understood and gone through exactly how we came to our solution, they're setting up this replicating portfolio. Unless they had done that, their initial reaction would have been, that can't be correct.
Just a last question about that period of trying to publish the paper. Were you frustrated with your colleagues' inability to understand what you were doing? Because you make it sound as if it was really quite a constructive time, that you were gradually getting hold of people who were able to understand what it was when they took the time to understand. And that sounds like a very positive sort of reinforcement.
Yeah, I had, in my view, I just had, maybe I was too young and naive, but I just thought that was part of science. I mean, I was this young person. I was not, this was maybe my third paper or something, and I had thought that in science that we try to, maybe naively, that we try to discover truth, and it's my responsibility, if I think I have the truth, to educate others about it. Obviously, I laughed when I read some of the criticisms of reviewers, because I said they're wrong, and then you have the choice to go back and try to articulate why you felt that they were wrong in their criticism, or they had missed important facets. But that's my responsibility, I thought, as a researcher. It is one's responsibility. It's the idea of individuals in life could have great ideas. Those ideas are lost. Why are the ideas lost? They don't take the time to communicate those ideas in a way that others can understand. And then one says, well, I had that idea. Why didn't others see it? So it's our responsibility, and that taught me a great lesson, that it is really how I communicate ideas, or how we communicate ideas as researchers, that show the import. Some researchers have great papers, but they're completely lost.
Yeah, that's a common story. You had a long and distinguished teaching career in universities. What advice did you give to your students apart from that?
Apart from, I'm sorry, about...
apart from the fact that they should learn to communicate their ideas.
I always had said that to them, that, well, one of the interesting parts, a lot of my students, my PhD students, they said, well, look, I mean, you're having trouble getting things published, or you're frustrated or whatever, and how your progress is going. I said, look at me. I mean, I had trouble with the Black Scholes paper. We couldn't get that published as well, and that you should think of this as part of the profession, and that you have your research and your ideas. That's only one part of it. It's the same thing, again, going back to our story of the architect. The architect has an idea, and they have to communicate it to their clients. They have to communicate it in a way that they sell their idea. They sell what they're doing, and they package it in a way that adds value. I always try to make it clear that that was the way they should do things. And I would spend a lot of time with them is trying to constructively criticize what they were doing, because if I cannot communicate an idea, or they cannot communicate ideas, that means that we do not understand it. You know, so you have, and one of the interesting parts of communication that has to improve your work as a theorist or an empirical researcher. I believe that we tend to go down the path that's familiar with us in the research, and having colleagues or other students or submitting papers for publication allow them, those who are involved, to actually force you to perturbate your thinking, force you to go away from that path that you think you understood, you're going down. And I've always said to them is to use anyone around, whether it's your fellow students or giving papers or the like, to actually allow you to get the perturbation, that's necessary. That perturbation, or then when people cause you to have to deviate from the path you're on, you can either see, yes, the path I'm on is correct, or I have to really worry that the path I'm on is not correct. And that way it enhances the output of work. It also enhances the selection of topics that you're involved in.
So tell everybody about your research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And try to listen to what they're saying.
Yes, yes. I think Rutherford said that you should be able to tell, you shouldn't be doing research unless you can tell your tobacconist about it, which is a rather sort of early 20th century concept. But
right, that's possibly true. I mean, we don't smoke anymore, so we might, or few of us smoke anymore, so we might not have the tobacconist, but that's true. Yeah. I mean, I think that teaching is wonderful that way, and I always have told them that if you have the ability to teach your research to your students, that makes it richer, and it allows you to see through their eyes and your own eyes in your communication of ideas whether it holds up. You know, like a lot of today, if I have ideas and a lot of reporters or a lot of people ask questions of me about my ideas, you obviously see through your own, you know, where things are wrong. I remember times when I was teaching where I would spend a half an hour putting a proof up on the board, and then a student asked me a question, or I asked myself a question, and I stop and say, sorry, that's not correct, you know, let's start over again, or I saw we have to go off in a different direction. But that's the excitement of being in the profession. It's take a profession that you're in and think of it not as a task to do work, but take it as that you can grow and you can learn. And if I can learn and grow and keep adding ideas, you know, that meant that I selected something that I enjoy, and I try to keep learning and growing in, and hope others learn and enjoy at the same time, and they can see the value and that you're learning and creating value.
You paint, that's a very exciting picture you paint of the teaching profession, and it might be thought therefore a little surprising that you left it before you needed to. You retired, I think, from being a full-time professor at Stanford in '96.
Correct.
What made you decide to take and you moved to concentrate more on fund management?
Correct.
What made you make that decision?
Well, it's interesting. I felt that I needed to repot myself. Okay. In other words, the idea is that I was a flower and needed to repot myself. In part because I was very frustrated in understanding or coming to understand sort of the some theory that was missing, or that I felt the theory of intermediation, how intermediaries worked and how markets actually were closed, or how how intermediaries made markets and closed them. And I had done preliminary research, but I didn't really think that I was able to get the data the way I wanted to get the data and think about the problem. And I felt that it was sort of necessary for me to understand it, to become immersed in it, as opposed to just sitting on the sidelines. I could have the theory of being a wonderful football player, but if I sometimes get into being a football player myself, I might be able to develop better theory. Yeah. And then you say that I've given up teaching, and in retrospect, actually,
Sorry, carry on.
Pardon me?
No, sorry, carry on. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay. I'm sorry that in teaching now, I tend to teach or talk to more students and interact with more students now than I did when I was a full-time researcher professor. But I give talks around the world, and I continue to give back in that way.
So there's more freedom to get out there and meet people.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And also, I felt that, in my view, because I was never left school. I started off in school and stayed in school. That was number one, and that I felt I wanted to become broader, and gave myself freedom to be broader, and not as parsimonious as I was in writing papers. And as a result of that, I didn't want necessarily to have to, I was going to say constrained, yeah, I'll use the word constrained, but be constrained by having to be within a set of paradigms. And so I can be broader in my thinking, and again, have fun and learn new things. So that's what I try. That's why I did it.
Was those all sound like very good reasons. Was there also an element of wanting to take risks? Because risk seems to have been sort of there in the background of your career, from the earliest days of investing in stock.
Right. I took a very I took a risky or riskless path. I never left home. In other words, I started off in academics and I stayed in academics. So someone would say, everything else being equal, that an academic is a very risk-averse person because they never leave home, and they stay with mother, so to speak, and it's a very familiar path. That's on the one hand, but on the other hand, being a researcher and teacher is quite a risky profession, because the first day you show up, and when I showed up the first day, they gave me a yellow pad, a pencil, and a piece of chalk, and they said, teach and do research. And so that is not as though you're in a constrained environment. You have a tabula rasa, so to speak, and we could be able to go off in any direction. So that was risky. I said I would wish to repot myself. Maybe it was the case, and I thought at the time, that you toggle my memory, that I didn't have to do very much more. I could, sort of be comfortable, and maybe I felt that, I had to kick myself in the rear end and see if I can do other things and not be comfortable.
Yeah, so impelling oneself into new experience. Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah. And I think that now I have a lot of that experience and a lot of thinking, and I've been sort of working on a book to actually write down sort of some of these theories, and thinking I've done that in lectures and in presentations, and trying to induce others to get involved in that research or that way of thinking about problems. But we'll see. Maybe it'll be successful.
Continue to bloom in your new pot. Yes.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for talking.
Oh, you're welcome. Very good. Good.
I thought that was very nice indeed. Thank you.
Oh, great. I hope it was what you wanted.
It was splendid. I hope you're happy with it too. But I think there was.
You said keep it general.
It was very general, but it was general, and yet sort of it was very specific to science research, and I think people will find that very illuminating. One of the things we have now is as well as putting the interviews up as a whole on the website, we have a Nobel channel on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And we get quite a lot of people visiting the site through that. And when we get good pieces of interviews, just sort of between, say, 2 and 5 minutes long, we tend to put them onto YouTube. And I think actually there was rather a wealth of stuff in there that people would like to hear.
Great. It's funny, one just a sort of anecdote, which as an aside, but I got a call one time from a professor from University of Michigan, and she was doing a study on the scientific method. So she wanted to know how I produce research, and so how do you think about ideas, So I said, well, I read the newspapers, or I read books or whatever, and I come up with an idea, and then I write down an equation or try to model it, and then noodle for a while and see how it comes out. And then after I think I've gotten as far as I can, and then I search the literature, read the literature, and see if others are on the same path I was, and then et cetera, and that. And then she said, no, that's not the way you do research. She said, that was completely wrong. That's not the way you do research. I said, what do you mean it's not the way you do research? Well, you go, first thing you do is you read the literature, you do a research, so I see what everyone else has done, and then you say, well, can you add anything to what they've done, and et cetera, et cetera. I said, well, okay, that's your paper, I'm not necessarily.
Really? She really believed that it all
the Kuhn method, sort of doing things. And so I think that actually it's kind of fascinating. I think a lot of creativity comes when you don't read the literature, But then sometimes you can be trapped because you can...
Yeah, you can discover too late that somebody else is already there, but...
Right. That's fine.
As long as you have... Yeah, exactly, as long as you have the security and the leeway just to...
Yeah, throw it out. Yeah. Right, so I've done that. I mean, I thought there was a new area, and I spent in one time 6 months trying to decode what everyone had said, and then I realized at the end of 6 months that they had just a new glossary, but it was old type of research, so threw it away. It's fine.
You have to take the losses with the gains.
Risk, you see, is fine. You have to take. Some people are so risk averse, they just want to make sure for sure they're going to be able to create something.
I don't think one would describe you as risk averse.
No, I agree.